Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
The session that we have is called The Climate Path Forward, Politics and Policy. And now before we get started, there's some things that I need to say to all of you. We are going to start with the University of Colorado's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it's located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with the Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. So we will all do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, faculty, and their work, educating, conducting research, and supporting student success and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. So thank you again, once again, welcome to the Conference on World Affairs and today's discussion. So for all of you, we ask that you remain respectful throughout the discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, noisemakers, other audible disruptions, which I doubt we're gonna have, are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. What we're going to do is have our panelists introduce themselves. We're going to have some questions among ourselves, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. We have Tan and we have Jen, who are going to be walking around when we go for questions from the audience with pieces of paper and pencils. And you are welcome and encouraged to write your questions on that. They will be collected and brought back up to me as the moderator. So when you have a question, please raise your hand, and a producer, these are our producers, will give you a note card and a pencil. Please print legibly, that helps me a lot. And now I would like to ask each of our panelists to introduce ourselves, and I remind our audience that full speaker bios are going to be found online. So first I'm going to ask Dr. Ernesto Araujo to introduce himself. He's a career diplomat and writer, currently living in Egypt. He was born in Brazil in Porto Alegre. He's a graduate in literature studies from the University of Brasilia and diplomacy from the Brazilian Diplomatic Academy. So I will let him go ahead and introduce himself, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barron. Really thrilled to be here with all of you in this atmosphere where I confess I feel much more at home than in diplomatic circles. I have 35 years in the diplomatic career, but I was always, I think, some sort of, how to say it, out of the, one flew over the cuckoo's nest, right? And that's sort of what I've been doing, trying to see things from different perspectives. That's basically what I tried to do when I was foreign minister of Brazil, 2019 to 2021, under President Bolsonaro, who, by the way, was also trying to change a lot of things in Brazil. And I try to see always things from the perspective of what needs to change, and not what needs to stay the same. I think it's always easier to defend the status quo, whatever it is, than to question the status quo, including in the question of climate that we are here to discuss. So today I'm, just to complement, I'm on a leave from this diplomatic career. So of course, whatever I speak here is on a personal basis. Today I dedicate myself mainly to trying to formulate new ideas, ways to see the world, and to also to teach. I have an online course, non-official online course for people in Brazil, which I call a course on logo politics, which is the idea of geopolitics, but amplified to the logos, which is human thought as a whole, with a concentration especially on the legacy of the Western civilization. Not legacy, because legacy looks like it's dead, right? It's not. The millennia-old challenges and the quest of the Western civilization for freedom, for truth, for justice. I think that's what also academia is called to do, to look for those values. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Next, I want to introduce Roger Pielke and have him introduce himself. Many of you may know him. He's a senior fellow now with the American Enterprise Institute, but he was on the campus for many years at CU Boulder. He focuses on science and technology policy, the politicization of science, government science, energy and climate. And I don't want to go further so I don't step on what he would like to say. Roger, go ahead, please.
Thanks, Jill. It's great to be here. I spent 24 years on the faculty here at CU Boulder. This is my first time back. I have to say, I don't really feel like I'm on the campus sitting in this windowless room. My office, if you go out on Grandview Avenue, is one of the bungalows there. It's still there, and it looks different now. So I do one thing. I study topics where science is contested on politically controversial issues. It used to be boring, and unfortunately it's not anymore. I've studied climate policy going back to the early 90s. I wrote a PhD on how climate science could be organized to better inform adaptation and mitigation decision making. Spent a decade at NCAR. If you come to the panel this afternoon on federal funding, I'll talk about NCAR and the situation NCAR's in. I look forward to chatting with you. It's probably the most interesting moment in climate policy that's underway right now in my career, spanning more than 30 years. And so I look forward to chatting with you about that.
Great, thank you. We initially had intended that this panel would have an international focus, a national focus, and a local focus. Casey Baker, if she shows up, we would love to have her come up to the panel, but we also have another distinguished panelist, and I'm going to introduce Dennis Ojima and let him take it from there. Dennis Ojima is director of the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at Colorado State University. He's an ecosystem ecologist who for years has worked in the international sphere, starting with the International Geosphere Biosphere Program in the 1980s, and I'll stop before I step on whatever he would like to say.
Thank you, Jill. It's an honor to be here, stepping into this panel with this illustrious colleagues of mine. As part of my research career, starting in the late 1980s, I started conducting research internationally on global environmental change and worked in the climate area quite extensively. Through the path of sort of research and engagement, really started working at that policy interface as well. Throughout, early in my career, working at issues related to looking at greenhouse gas methodologies to reduce emissions to the atmosphere, especially from agricultural systems. So working in the food production system, looking at policy and science needs in that arena. Looked also at aspects of carbon sequestration and really looking at soil carbon and land productivity, especially in rangelands, is important. mechanisms for reducing emissions and working at the policy level in a variety of countries around the world, especially in semi-arid areas, to look at how we can enhance their abilities, local communities' abilities, to look at sequestering carbon and actually benefiting from the resources, funding financial resources that would be gained from them. And then recently, really looking at the issue of adaptation and the policy interface between what we know about nature-based solutions from the ecosystem perspective to how do we implement these at the local scale. And I've worked in many years in Mongolia with the Ministry of Nature and Environment, and university colleagues there, and other NGOs, and really trying to navigate the complex world of international policy and development policy. And then how do you align those to local governance issues, local practices at levels where the action really takes place? And if you want to see changes in, how do we adapt? How do we become more resilient? How do you actually deal with climate change impacts? It's at that local level. And so working toward alignment of various policies that come from international frameworks to local government projections and needs, and then local practices, it's a very challenging arena to work in, environment, and it's often obtuse about how do you actually start framing those connections. And so working along those lines are some of the stories that I'll try to share with you later in our conversation.
Sounds great. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here. I think this is a great turnout. So assuming climate change is real and solutions exist, why is progress so hard? This is actually just the introduction that you'll find in your program if you look at it, but it sets the stage for what we're going to talk about. The goal of our discussion today is to examine how society can move forward given different perspectives on urgency, risk, and appropriate response, political incentives, economic trade-offs, and public acceptance, all very strong action and sustainable. Panelists are going to explore what kinds of climate policies are most likely to succeed today and how these can be designed to balance. Panelists today, and then you paths forward. Just press that down. Assuming climate change is real and solutions exist, why is progress so hard on a local, national, and international level? And any one of you who are willing to take it off, go for it, please.
All right. At the diplomat. So yes, climate change is real, and it is an extremely difficult problem. And I'm just going to focus on the mitigation side. We can talk about adaptation, crucially important. And I'm going to narrow it down to accumulating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, primarily from the burning of fossil fuels. If you look at published research, about 80% of the radiative forcing increase expected this century comes from carbon dioxide emissions. And so it's not everything, but it's a big chunk. One reason why reducing carbon dioxide emissions is so difficult is look around you. Look at what you're wearing. Everything that we have in our modern society is built out of fossil fuels. Everything. 85% of energy consumed last year internationally in the United States came from fossil fuels. The challenge is always going to be a century scale challenge. It's not a 2030 challenge, it's not a 2050 challenge. I will say, I've been a critic of the international process because it's kind of like a Rube Goldberg device. There is low-hanging fruit for action to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. The lowest of the low-hanging fruit is coal. Coal does not need to be burned for electricity. Now, cement, it's a little different matter. There's chemical processes involved. But coal by itself is responsible for about 40% of carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels. The United States has been on a path of eliminating coal for a long while now. Don't pay attention to what happens in the White House with executive orders and press conferences. President Trump cannot save the coal industry in the US. One thing, hopefully we'll get to talk about, is that economic forces are much bigger than the White House forces. Just for fun, I drew a straight line through the decline of coal. And if you extend it forward, the US is out of coal, I think February 4th, 2031 at 10:15 a.m. One thing that would make progress a lot more tangible is if instead of focusing on emissions, which is an outcome, the world negotiated a coal exit treaty. It would be enormously difficult. China and India in particular are heavily reliant on coal. Just in the last few weeks, following the war starting, US-Israel war in Iran, South Korea and Japan announced they were changing their policies for their coal plants to increase the capacity, so the amount of hours that they could be burnt over a year, because they want energy security. So getting off of coal would be tricky, but we have all the technologies. Natural gas is still a fossil fuel, but it has half the carbon intensity of coal. So if we snapped our fingers, replaced all coal in the world with natural gas, you'd reduce global emissions by 20%. Nuclear power, which I'm a fan of, would reduce pretty much all of those coal-fired emissions. There are places like Germany that have talked about a coal phase-out. Even in Germany, it's difficult because Eastern Germany is heavily dependent on coal historically, lignite, some of the dirtiest coal. There was a study that was done here at the University of Colorado, it's probably been 7 or 8 years ago, which found that if you just took the dirtiest coal plants, say the top 30, there's one in Bulgaria, there's some in Southeast Asia, and you shut them down, you could reduce global emissions of carbon dioxide by something like 10%. It's order of magnitude estimate. So there is low-hanging fruit. There is enormously difficult. There's some high fruit there also. Petrochemicals, for example, what we get from the bottom of the barrel of oil that's not gasoline or diesel. When I say that everything, literally everything that you see in this room, except the human flesh, is made out of fossil fuels. You can't make a solar panel or a wind turbine using solar energy and wind energy. Steel, concrete, all of those are enormously difficult to replace. I'll end there. I'm actually optimistic, and I'll be happy to talk to you about why I'm optimistic about the future trajectory of climate change. It is a difficult moment right now, but I think that the future is brighter than we often allow ourselves.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, well, we're assuming climate change is real, right? Which I think is a big assumption, but I'll agree with that assumption for now. I would say that a big part of the problem is, to use the title of Professor Pilkey's book, the lack of an honest broker. We don't have an honest broker in the world to deal with the path of climate policies. I think all the discussion on climate policies is totally penetrated by political, geopolitical interests. I would say that if we are in a climate emergency, what you should do, you should say, oh, what's the problem? CO2 emissions. Okay, let's look at who emits CO2. China emits, I believe, 40% of CO2, and China is allowed by the international agreements to keep pumping CO2 into the atmosphere until 2030, and to peak only in 2030, whereas the democratic West is required to, or was before President Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement, required to already start decimating its energy capacity by a premature energy transition. So What's been going on, I think, for the last 20, 25 years is a huge transfer of economic power from the democratic West towards the People's Republic of China. And that's not the way to deal with climate emergency or climate issues. Oh, China has the right to develop, so okay, if you're in an emergency, that's the kind of thing you should give up. I think that's one of the elements that make me think that it's not a climate emergency, because if it were, people would be acting differently. I think it's a set of political interests that is driving and instrumentalizing the question of climate in order to make the world more totalitarian, both through the increasing power of the Communist Party of China, which rules China and wants to rule the world, and the power of Western political elites. Right? I think that's a very important question for us here. What does the way climate policies are approached bring to the political elites in the West? Brings more power, more ways to control society, to control the economy. What climate policies have been doing is to artificially create scarcity in Western Europe, or in Europe as a whole, in the United States, and Latin America too, in an era that could be an era of abundance. I think to a large extent, climate change is, or the climate change policies are an answer to the problem that abundance created for the totalitarians of the world. The 90s were an era where we believed that we would have more and more abundance, not only of material goods, but also of information, of access to information, freedom as a whole, democratic freedom in countries, right, through the internet, including internet is an incredibly democratizing instrument, including for science. And everyone who likes states to rule people, like the Communist Party of China and Western elites, they said, well, we cannot, where will we be? People will start to be free, too free, what we can do, right? So that's when climate change policies come in. Oh, let's say, let's assume that we have a set of facts that are going to destroy the planet, and say, okay, we would like to give you more freedom, but no, unfortunately we can't. We have to control you more, and we have to make you poorer. We have to replace cheap energy by expensive energy. We have to replace the West as an economic, democratic West, as an economic powerhouse, with China as an economic powerhouse. And that's, I think, what's behind. So without going into the question of reality or not of the science of climate change, but the political science of climate change is something that tends to make the world more totalitarian. You have the problem of governments that want to have more control, and you have also the problem, I believe many of you are involved with NGOs, I'm sorry to say that, but NGOs in many cases, in some cases, or I don't know how many cases, but okay, NGOs tend to be great and well-intentioned, well-meaning, but in many cases, NGOs are used to pump money in a way that is not transparent, that is not accountable. We had that experience in Brazil. We had a congressional hearing, a set of hearings that showed how environment NGOs in Brazil were not transparent, received a lot of money from the country, but especially from abroad, and no one knows what they did with that money in a country that is plagued by corruption like Brazil. That's very serious. But so, oh, but we are here to save the planet. No, in many cases, the planet has nothing to do with that. Money is going to the pockets of corrupt politicians under the excuse of saving the planet. Well, just to that's just to start. Okay, I think it's a political problem much more than a scientific problem.
Thank you very much. This is shaping up to be great. Dr. Ojima, I'm going to let you go.
So, in thinking about sort of the climate policy mechanisms, You have the international policy, which is complicated because of the consensus process that is embedded in decision-making at that level. And it's, if it was left to city-states, like, let's take California, it's simpler. It's easier for that body of legislators to actually set policy for their state. But the consensus process at the UN level, which means every word in a document has to be agreed upon by the conference of members of the party. And all the signatures have to agree on the language of these documents, and that's a very burdensome, lift for setting policy. But once a decision is made at that level, then it really carries weight across the international community. And so there's value in that consensus process. It's burdensome, it's slow, it causes all these sort of funny wording and things. So at COP meeting a couple of years ago, they talked about, having a line in there about ending fossil fuels. And both the fossil fuel countries, the Middle East and, the U.S., and the less developed countries said, wait a minute. They said, no, that language, we can't really abide by that. We can't eliminate fossil fuels because, and the arguments from the least developed countries were really interesting. The last 30 years, you've been telling us to build energy efficiency, go to electricity. We built our infrastructure around, natural gas, some coal, fuel oil. And we invested, and we're in debt to you. You loaned us the money. We're billions of dollars of debt to the developed nations. And now you're telling us to turn all that off and switch to renewables. Now, who's going to pay for that? And so they had a very cogent argument of why that policy decision was nixed. Very close. It was highly debated. It just went into hours and hours of negotiations. But yet, you understood of climate change, but yet they don't have the resources, and so the climate policy around the financial mechanisms is important as well. And these, move forward in these very slow, deliberate processes so that the global benefits will eventually emerge. And as someone stands backs behind climate change science, the dramatic changes that we're seeing in the Earth system, yet to see the slowness of the policy mechanisms. But there are other places where policies can't be done more quickly, and you see these in how different companies, private sectors, kind of set their business plans, and that's a policy level decision in how they're looking at. And it's a bottom line thing where you can see better efficiencies, better economic gain by some of the business policies they're making. And so it's an interesting question about, why is climate policy so complicated? The various levels and nuances at which people are making these decisions are not often clear to the individual in a village somewhere in Mongolia or Africa, or in rural Colorado. Because why it's so plain?
Thank you. This is all great. One topic that I didn't hear any of you mention, but is near and dear to my heart, because I work on issues of agriculture, is that a huge amount of greenhouse gases come out of our agricultural sector. Of course, we all have to eat, but our agricultural sector in most countries of the world is built around fossil fuels, and as we increasingly produce meat for consumption, especially for nations that are becoming more developed over time and their demand for meat is going up, methane has become an incredibly important greenhouse gas. And I don't know if any of you would like to address that. We have a colleague at Stanford University. whose name just escaped me, but who talks about how we could actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions very rapidly by controlling our methane emissions instead of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, that's Rob Jackson. Rob Jackson.
Yeah, it's Rob Jackson, my apologies. And
But-
let me ask each of you as you respond to hold the thing down, hold the microphone down the whole time you're speaking.
I mean, just a quick response. I think there's an interesting experiment going on right now where fertilizer costs are going skyrocketing high. We're going to see reduced, applications of fertilizer this coming year. So it'd be interesting to see whether or not we can observe a reduction in nitrous oxide, for instance, from agriculture, like we saw during the gas crises in earlier times, where we saw declines in CO2 emissions from different developed nations.
Yeah, that's a great response, but it's not just nitrous oxide, it's methane.
Yeah, and methane is natural gas, and fertilizers, nitrogen-based fertilizers, come from natural gas, fossil fuel. And I don't know what the number is, 20 or 30% of fertilizers come through the Strait of Hormuz. So one of the big impacts that we're going to see could be food crises and a lot of human suffering around the world in the next year because of the disruptions. On methane specifically, when I talk to people who are in the oil and gas industry, there's a lot of positive sentiment that, yeah, there's a lot of simple fixes for reducing leakage, fitting pipes tighter, and a lot of methane is flared off, it's burned. Due to the production of petroleum, it also produces natural gas, and if you don't have a pipeline, a way to store it, a way to ship it, then it's cheaper for companies just to burn it off. And you can look, satellite pictures, you can see North Dakota, you can see Nigeria, you can see a lot of places around the world where methane is just simply burned off. That's fuel, and that's fuel that if it's burned for human betterment, that's probably better than just flaring methane out into the atmosphere. So I would put methane into that basket of things that I call low-hanging fruit, because there's a lot that can be done on methane.
If I may, I think methane is also a good example of the politicization of science. If you allow me. Until 2015, more or less, the year of the Paris Agreement, all the talks about climate change were about the CO2 emissions. Methane was often mentioned, but as a residual problem, or a much smaller problem. I don't remember the figures that were used, but kind of 3% of emissions, or 3% of the cause of global warming, according to that theory, only came from methane. After 2015, with the success of the Paris Agreement from the point of view of, let's say, the climate change arguments, and the, let's say, the worldwide acceptation of the need to reduce CO2 emissions, which leads to control of the energy sector, then you start to have a whole discussion on methane that didn't exist before, and suddenly methane became the big villain. And why is that? Well, there's the science, okay, but there's the politics, what the politics mean. Less methane means less meat. Less meat means less protein. Less protein means less health for the people. Brazil is one of the biggest, or the biggest producer of bovine meat in the world. Meat used to be cheap in Brazil for a long time. What was the consequence? Along 30 years, Brazilians became much healthier, became taller. You see that clearly in the stature statistics. And now, all of a sudden, no, you cannot have cheap meat because of methane and because of the climate. So the cost of meat increased absurdly in a country that is kind of the, I like to say Brazil is the Saudi Arabia of protein. And suddenly meat is as expensive as it's here comparatively. And people are having less meat, which means less protein, less health. Again, I think that goes back to the question of how to create scarcity instead of create abundance, how to control what people can eat or not eat. Well, climate change already allows governments to control more and more where you go. Now they can control also what you eat. Countries like the Netherlands, because of the methane, basically, I think, arguments or theory, destroyed their agriculture. The Netherlands were the biggest producers of food in the world, and they're destroying their agriculture. Spain is in the same line. Ireland is in the same line. But the question, the situation of the Netherlands, I think, is extremely is an extreme example of that. So it's an artificial creation of scarcity of food. Right? So I have this dystopian view of the future that climate policies can bring. A world where instead of getting into your car and having cheap gas and going whatever you want, you have to go into public transportation and show the authorities where you want to go and why you want to go. Why do you want to go visit your aunt that lives 20 miles from your house? You have to stay within 10 miles of your house, right? That's in the West, in the democratic West. Right? And it sounds like totalitarian China or whatever. And now, why no? You can only eat, I don't know how many pounds of meat a year, like in Cuba, for example, maybe 2 or 3 pounds of meat a year, because of to save the planet. Meanwhile, China is importing all not all, but most of the meat that Brazil produces and feeding their people with good meat. Anyway, just some inconvenient facts.
So that's an interesting view. We also have Roger Pielke saying he's an optimist about this. I would like to know how do we get out of this mess? And what are our paths forward? I have some ideas, but I'm just moderating, so I would love to hear you say ways that we can move out. I know Dennis Ojima talked a little bit about state-level controls, and I think Colorado is a leader in trying to enact some of those. But let me turn it back to Roger for a second.
Sure. So in the academic world of policy, we have this class of problems that are called wicked problems. These are problems that can't be solved. Crime is an example. Public health. But we can do better or worse. They wouldn't let me show a PowerPoint today, so I'm going to ask you to use your imaginations. I call this the most interesting straight line I've ever seen. So there's a metric that we use to measure decarbonization of the economy. It's carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP. So think tons of carbon dioxide per $1,000 of GDP. In general, people want GDP to go up because people like material wealth, particularly people in poor parts of the world. And we want CO2 emissions to go down. So when that ratio decreases, we are decarbonizing our economy. And we want that to go really, really low if we want to hit something approximating net zero. So since the 1960s, that curve, the decarbonization of the economy, is a straight line. There's no inflection point. This is a really uncomfortable fact for people who've been involved in international negotiations, domestic policy. There is zero evidence that anything we have done in climate policy has altered the trajectory of that curve. More simplistically, go to 2005. Look at US carbon dioxide emissions, the aggregate emissions. It's a straight line from 2005 to 2025. No president, no Congress has affected that. There are two big blips. One is the global financial crisis, one is the pandemic. There is no evidence that any policies that we put in place have altered that background rate of decarbonization. That's good news and bad news. The bad news, obviously, is all this talk, all this action, all these policies put in place in the name of climate policy haven't really had discernible effects on decarbonization. But the good news is the background rate is a decline. And if you take that straight line and you do what you're not supposed to do, what I teach in my policy classes, and you extend it forward into the future, we get to close to net zero in the second half of the century. It's not 2050, but it might be 2080. Maintaining that rate of decarbonization is it's not for free, it's not magic, it's not something that happens without paying attention. It takes an awful lot of work. Historically, that decrease in carbon dioxide per unit of GDP has been driven by efficiency gains. People like to get more output from less inputs. That makes things cheaper. When we talk about fertilizer or whatever it happens to be, if we can have less input, including energy inputs, and get more output, we like that. Going forward, that is not going to drive that curve. It's going to be substituting carbon-intensive sources of energy with less carbon-intensive sources. One reason why climate change will never be solved is, number one, if you just look at the technologies that are available, it is impossible to get to net zero without having some form of carbon capture and storage. Fossil fuels are enormously useful. Again, we can't replace a lot of hard-to-abate sectors. And so at some point, it's not right now, but some point in the decades ahead, we're going to have to decide, do we want to deploy technologies to suck carbon out of the air and put it somewhere? The bigger reason, my dad's a famous atmospheric scientist, and he studied non-carbon related influences on climate. Humans have a big footprint on this planet. There are a lot of influences that we have on the climate system that go beyond the burning of fossil fuels and carbon dioxide and methane. How we use the land, how we irrigate the land, how we put particulates up into the atmosphere. The human effect on the climate system is pretty significant. And even if I snap my fingers, carbon dioxide emissions went away, we still would have climate change. So to some degree, we're going to have to learn how to live in this volatile planet that we are influencing as actors on that planet. The good news is we're pretty inventive, and we've done a pretty good job of that so far. So I really emphasize that people should focus on the numbers. What are we doing that's affecting the rate of decarbonization? How can we bend that curve? Most people, and I get it, they're not very happy when I show data that shows that climate policy hasn't done much to date. But at the same time, the expectation is we're in a period now where global emissions have plateaued. At least they're increasing within measurement error at the moment. It was only 20 years ago where we thought emissions would be going skyrocketing. So there is good news out there, but we just need to be much more intentional in trying to bend that curve. And again, focus on the low-hanging fruit first and not the hardest things. People talk about getting that last ton of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. I'm just worried about getting the next ton out.
Would either of you like to comment?
Can I? Yeah, very briefly. When I served in the United States in Washington, D.C., and 2010 to 2015, I used to read a lot, try to read a lot on climate change, and or climate. And one thing that I recall is that emissions were tending to go down in the United States in the absence of official policies through the mere fact of changes in the economy and in the behavior of people. So especially with e-commerce and also the possibility of home work, which apparently had a huge impact in the use of fossil fuels for transportation, without the need to create scarcity, right? So as a natural consequence of how the market economy works, and also that fossil fuel efficiency was going up. So one thing is to get rid of fossil fuels, and the other thing is to use them more efficiently, so less emissions from cars, things that were going on. And I remember colleagues who were climate negotiators, and I said, well, isn't that the way to, let's say, to foster market-friendly solutions and, let's say, natural economic solutions? Because, look, the United States is the villain of, or was the villain because of the previous Bush policies of climate, but its emissions are flat or decreasing. So isn't that the way? So no, but it doesn't, like, it's not like that. It's not valid. Okay. Oh, you have to decrease So what's the question? What's the purpose? To decrease emissions or to decrease emissions in a certain way? And my impression was that for people dealing with that sort of power structure, it's not sufficient to decrease emissions through full efficiency or through the natural evolution of markets. No, you need to have more control over people and more scarcity. And just to sum up, something that is, I mean, as any summing up, is provisional, but and to come back to what I said before, I think we have an option between either a free world or a carbon-free world. If we keep going towards a carbon-free world, we'll have a sort of totalitarian global dictatorship. And the day they establish a global totalitarian dictatorship, they will totally get away from any sort of climate policies because their objective will have been attained, and then we'll not have a carbon-free world. Okay, that will be an avenue towards the imposition of a totalitarian global system, and the people who run that sort of show, I think before 2080, in the current perspective, will say, well, we never cared about climate, we were here for power, so now forget all of that. Anyway.
I guess there's an additional dimension to the climate policies that we're talking about, in that it gets into the concept of Earth stewardship. And I'm going to say that a narrow focus on fixing the climate may be too narrow of a perspective of the challenges society is faced with today. That by focusing on energy efficiency and what we do with energy production overlooks the general pattern of humanity to consume natural resources in a way that is detrimental to the Earth system. So I think the discussion of climate change policies need to be embedded within a larger conversation about the future of the Earth and the future of society as we look at our responsibility to be stewards to the Earth. And, I think that, having either nuclear power or lithium batteries or renewable energy batteries and things will lead us into unintended consequences in the mining sector, of extraction, of other activities, other perverse outcomes that narrow focus, without taking an Earth stewardship perspective and looking at more, I guess the buzzword today is looking at sustainable development or sustainable pathways forward, so that we have, more of a Earth system perspective of what humanity is doing to the Earth. And I think, so it adds an extra dimension of complexity and difficulty. But I think if we ignore it completely, we'll just get ourselves into a problem area that is foreseen. We know the problems of mining and extraction and in these things, as well as the climate change issues. But we need to think our way through how do we do this in a more systemic, more sustainable fashion.
So this is great. If any of you have questions, I encourage you to raise your hands and fill out a card. And while you're doing that, we have about 20 minutes left in this program. I really like your idea, Dennis, about taking this and putting it in an Earth stewardship perspective, but that maybe makes it more complicated rather than less complicated. And Roger talked a little bit earlier about having the line of fossil fuels slowly attenuating all by itself because of technology, maybe because of technology. But that's the question I want to raise with all of you, is there a role for technology, not a panacea, because I know it can't be, but how can we use that technology? And just to prime that, in my consideration of agriculture, there's a lot of talk right now about green ammonia, which is a way of making ammonia fertilizers from either using solar or wind power. And there's a lot of talk among the inter-ocean transport corporations about using green ammonia as an alternative fuel to fossil fuels for ocean-going ships. So either any of you who want to talk about or tackle technology, please do.
Yeah, I mean, the only way that we achieve deep decarbonization of the economy is through technology. This is, you know, a lot of the things that Ernesto is talking about power, about control. I mean, it's Mike Hume, who's at Cambridge University, has likened climate change to a Christmas tree. Everybody hangs their ornament on it, whatever it happens to be. It's been a broadly expansive issue. But if the goal is a narrow goal, and I'm going to make it really narrow, it's to eliminate carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. Again, not the whole climate change pie, but a big slice of it. Then that is 100% a technology problem. There's a lot of talk about lifestyle changes and things like that. I think we have to recognize that there are maybe 2 billion people on this planet who live with the access to energy services that we all pretty much take for granted every day. That means that there's about 7 billion who don't yet have that access. And they're going to get it, whether they burn coal or they use solar and batteries or whatever. And that means that energy consumption on planet Earth by humanity is going to double, triple, maybe more this century. And so I'm a huge fan of efficiency. Efficiency makes us all better off. But there is no scenario that you can have of the future where humanity doesn't produce massive amounts more energy. And that means that it is entirely a technology problem. So set aside the Christmas tree. If carbon dioxide is your focus and that's how you think about climate change, it's a technology problem. If it's a lifestyle problem, power problem, well, that's something altogether different.
Well, it has to do with technology, but also with policy, if you allow me. Because I would like to make clear, I don't deny that there are environmental problems, and even that climate change exists. The question is where it comes from and the dramaticity of it. But anyway, and I think Professor Piocchi was talking about the local issues, right? And I would say that in the global discussion, too often it is forgotten that you have a local climate which answer in response to different causes than CO2 or methane, deforestation, for example, which was, of course, a big problem in my country. So sometimes they say, oh, you went to deforest the Amazon because you were skeptical of climate change policies. No, not at all. It's the opposite. Right? I think more attention should be given, for example, to deforestation, because the question is not only, let's stop deforestation not to emit more CO2. No, let's stop deforestation because it's bad for in many other aspects. So back when I was in cabinet and government, we started to design a plan, which unfortunately was not followed up. But the concept was to create some sort of the green Silicon Valley in the Amazon region in Brazil to attract clean investment in new technology areas, which can provide jobs for people who today are very poor and at the end of the day have to make their living out of illegal logging or illegal mining. So I mean, that's a kind of local solution that has to do with the economy, with market economy, with private investment, and not with government policies. Because the idea was not for the government to create that, but to create the regulation atmosphere that, or regulatory climate that could lead up to that sort of solution. And I'm talking too much, but one more question, because now I live in Egypt. Egypt has a very interesting example of consequences of climate change, which is the Nile, of course. In the deep antiquity, the Nile used to have 9 branches in its delta. Okay, today it has 2, but most of them dried up in the pre-Christian era, a long time ago. The branches started to dry up in ancient Egypt, right? So, of course, because of climate change, but in the moment where CO2 emissions were not the issue, methane emissions were not the issue, because of local conditions in the desert, in the raining regime, and things like that. But things were made worse in 1964 with the Aswan Dam, which destroyed the age-old inundations, floods of the Nile, and dried up even more the delta. So modern wrong policies, together with natural phenomena of antiquity, kind of add up, but all in a local perspective and not in a global perspective.
So obviously I should have asked for questions earlier, because I'm inundated with really amazing questions to ask the panel. And I'm going to start with one. Okay, several studies show that climate change mitigation strategies do not progress further because of its lack of a sense of urgency or relevance to people. It's too important or complicated, and right now the number one topic resonating with people is the cost of living and loss of jobs. And so how do we get beyond that? And you have said policies do not work. How do we move beyond that problem and get to someplace forward-looking?
I'll go first on that one. I wrote a book in 2010 called The Climate Fix, and in it I coined this term, which caught on a bit, called the iron law of climate policy, which says that if we pit economics versus reducing emissions, economics is going to win every time. There was a theory of change present in the climate movement early on, and you can still see it in the economics literature, that if we make dirty fuels more expensive, fossil fuels more expensive, that'll help people to be motivated to advocate for cheaper alternatives like wind and solar and so on. In economics, that makes perfect sense. People respond to financial incentives. In politics, that doesn't work. If you make energy more expensive, which means you make everything more expensive, people get pissed off. Just think about the yellow vest protests in France, which was only a few euro cents fuel duty. One response to efforts to make energy more expensive, it's not the only reason, but is the rise of populists who say, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to make your energy cheap. Whether they do so or not, we could debate. So the only way that we make progress on decarbonization is to align economic interests with decarbonization. And that means making things cheaper, learning how to produce energy that costs less. So I'll give you the example. The Vogtle nuclear power plant in Georgia came online last year. The two new nuclear reactors came online. It was beset by cost overruns, schedule delays. But people in Georgia now have cost certainty in their electricity bills to the 2080s. Guess what? Their electricity is not going to go up because of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. So we have technologies that people can get behind because it offers cost certainty. One of the biggest changes I've seen over really the last year, 2 years, in the discussion of climate change is change among Democrats in the United States talking about affordability. You don't have people saying we need to make energy costs much more expensive because of climate change. We did have politicians who said that. The Republicans are saying that, but they're taking every action to make energy more expensive. So maybe the hats have switched a little bit in the parties. But until we recognize as part of climate policy that economics and decarbonization have to move in the same direction, that's the only way it works.
Thank you, that was great. I'm going to direct this next question to Dennis, because even though you think that we're on a path toward sort of carbon neutrality, and I hope that's true, this question says, given that climate change is this giant global problem, and we haven't yet made a meaningful impact at the global level, should we focus more on mitigation or radically shift right now to adaptation?
it's not an if and or question. I think, in a sense, we need to be adapting now and looking at what adaptation actions can actually lead to mitigation as well. I think some of the aspects of looking at insulating your house and sort of looking at how do you make your housing, your infrastructure more energy efficient is both, a way to adapt to the climate changes that you're experiencing, as well as then reducing the energy impact on that infrastructure. So I think, in a sense of, if we look at our road infrastructure and how do we adapt, especially in the coastal areas, then thinking about ways of doing that that can help build more resilient road structures, but do it in a way that isn't as energy intensive. So I think really thinking about the life cycle of what your adaptation activities are, and making sure that you're not, your resulting actions don't increase the type of processes that would influence climate change. So really you have to think mitigation and adaptation as a two-part solution space.
I'm looking at questions. Hold on. You've given me way too many here. One of these questions, which I actually want Ernesto to tackle first, is how can climate change be tackled in a start small, think big methodology? And a number of the comments that have come in talk about how in Boulder many people have voluntarily opted for electric cars, solar energy. This isn't a totalitarian thing, and up in Fort Collins we have done the same. But most of the rest of the world doesn't have the economic luxury that we have in Colorado. So could this start small, think big type of methodology work? And do you think it could make a change on a global scale? And I want to start with Ernesto.
Thank you. No, definitely. I think small changes can add up to big changes, and I like that concept of voluntarily doing things. Everything that's voluntary I think is good. I'm a firm believer, and every day more, in democracy. Not only institutionalized democracy, but real democracy. And I think new technologies allow for it. I have more and more a dream of coming back to direct democracy, so democracy without politicians, people really taking decisions in a sort of cloud or what have you way with the new technologies. So if you leave it up to individual decisions, I think there's a question, there's the concept of the wisdom of the crowds or intelligence of the crowds. I'm also a firm believer in that, right? Even if all the politicians dealing with climate were well-intentioned, which they are not, they would not be able to get the best solutions. So open up for the whole society, for the whole world to discuss that freely. We have the technological means today to allow for that sort of discussion and ideas and initiatives, and let's see. And I think the magic would happen from there.
Does anyone else want to address that question?
Yeah, I'll take the other side of that one. Individual actions, if it makes you feel good, do it. But I have my students go through the exercise, do the math. And one of the frustrating things, or maybe it's one of the empowering things about climate policy, is it needs policy. Individual actions aren't going to do it. And so if you want to engage in individual actions that make a difference, remind people that we have a U.S. Congress, that the U.S. Congress hasn't talked about energy policy comprehensively for 20 years. And the only way that we get durable policy in this country is bipartisan and people who agree, even though they have a lot of differences. And so the only way climate policy works, don't be fooled that if you get an electric car, you're making a difference. If it makes you feel good, do it. But getting the U.S. government back to working, which is reminding people that Article 1 is the Congress, is pretty important. And internationally, if the U.S. does not participate in international processes, we're missing out. And so I mean, for me, every one of us has a responsibility to try to depolarize our current politics, which is really hard to do. But climate policy can't work unless we do that.
So that leads into another question, and you might have just answered it. How much can policy slow down progress or increase policy, I'm paraphrasing, as we move away from coal and toward renewables or natural gas? Can policy really make a difference?
I'll just quickly say, I mean, yes. I mean, with respect to energy policy and climate policy, we have to keep the timescales in mind. So as I mentioned, U.S. emissions have dropped successively since 2005, for the last 20 years. That was the result of policy, not a policy that was passed in 2005. It was the result of policies that were passed in the 1970s that led to public and private sector collaboration that developed the technologies of fracking and natural gas. Cheap natural gas displaced coal, which led to this successive reduction in emissions. This is why it's so important to have comprehensive energy policy in this country. It's not for what happens next year or 2030 even. It's what happens in 2050. And you know, the atrophying of our ability to consider longer-term policies in this country is enormously difficult. So yes, policy can make a huge difference, but we have to try.
I was going to try to sum up here, and I will.
Can I just add a comment, just from the science side, a caveat that, you know, policy is a very strong mechanism, and we need to push for good policies. The Earth system, though, is a wonderful, complex organism, and even if we go to zero emissions, the embedded CO2 in the atmosphere and in the oceans are going to equilibrate. And so despite what we might hear from politicians about, you know, getting to CO2, the actual Earth response is going to be lagging behind the policy mechanism. So I encourage policy development wholeheartedly, but totally you have to do that in the light of understanding the Earth system response, especially the ocean, and how it's going to degas and equilibrate with the atmosphere over time. And so we're talking about a century-level, multi-generational problem that we should have started, you know, decades ago, but we're dealing with it now.
So I am going to do my best, and I will fail at trying to sum up what we've heard. I'm going to start with what Dennis just said. Taking an Earth system approach to this problem and a long-term view is going to be very important. Effective policies can work, but right now the line of gross domestic product or economic growth and fossil fuel emissions is this a one-to-one relationship, and we need to somehow move that so it's flatter. It apparently is going that way all by itself, which is excellent. We need incentives for corporations, for governments, for people to take those roles. And we have to embed that in our larger discussion of humanities as stewards. I find that very optimistic. I mean, we all have to work at all levels in order to turn the tide here. For many of our children and our children's children, they will, and beyond that, they will be feeling the effect of climate change long past after we are all gone. But I think that that's a very encouraging discussion. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank all of you for attending. What I've been asked is that if you all, when you're done, are willing to come down here, we have another 10 minutes where you can ask them individual questions before the next panel and audience comes into this room. So thank you very much. Let's give them all a round of applause.
Jill and the producers, is there a possibility